Mic test. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." And 7 pairs of the birds of heavens also, male and female, to keep their offsprings alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made will I blot out from the face of the ground. Amen. May be seated. Okay, so we're just going to continue on with the loose ends for the flood history as well as the flood proper, which means the actual events of the flood. So I have a question. Actually, it's not my question. It's the questions that people have concerning Noah's flood. If all creatures were corrupt before God, then what was the significance of dividing, or like what's the point of dividing animals according to clean and unclean if all animals are corrupt? So as said before, clean animals represent those that have some kind of trait or character that anticipate the Messiah of God and his character and trait. So unclean animals represent those that do not have these traits. But like shadows and figures of the real thing, they only have 1 or 2. They don't have the complete package. They don't have all the things for those specific animals that are supposed to portray the Messiah. So animals aren't clean in their essence. They have become corrupted through sin. But what God is saying is, by his word, he's declaring some animals clean and some animals unclean. Not in their essence, but because God said what is clean and what is unclean. And that's going to be kind of important. It's actually a reflection back on Adam, the Genesis 1 and 2, where God said, this tree is holy, or this tree you're not supposed to eat, and then all the others you can eat. It's not that the tree had something particular thing about it which made God say, don't eat from the tree. It's because God said, don't eat from the tree, that makes the tree particularly unique, and we're not supposed to eat from that, or Adam was not supposed to eat from that. So in any case, so if that's true, right, unclean animals represent those that do not have these traits, but are like shadows and figures of the real thing. So they don't have all the characters that the Messiah is supposed to have. They don't represent what the Messiah is supposed to be. So what is that? What does all this mean then? Well, there's several things. For one, it's not the shadow or figure of the Messiah that saves, but the actual Messiah that saves. And this is going to be important later on when we get to the Old Testament laws about animal sacrifice. And whether it actually forgives sin, or is it a placeholder to temporarily suspend God's wrath. So when God commands burnt offerings as substitutionary sacrifices, right? So God commands, you must sacrifice these things as substitutionary sacrifices. Only those out of all those listed traits that God said this represents, this kind of animal and this kind of animal is clean if it has these traits. Only those animals that has the listed characteristics. In other words, only those animals that have the Christ-pointing traits in the fullest of the sense in which God has listed, those are the only ones that are acceptable to God. Because only that Messiah sent by God is acceptable to be a substitutionary sacrifice. So in other words, when God says clean animals must have XYZ property or properties, right? ABC properties and XYZ properties. It's representing something about the Messiah. And God says they have to have all of these characters that I'm going to list. If they don't have all of it, then it's only a figure. It's not the full thing. And the point is, only that Messiah, which God's described, like only that Messiah is the one that can save. Not the figures, not the shadows. The rest are unacceptable because they are not the actual thing, but are figures. They don't have all of these traits that God's going to list, and therefore do not represent that Messiah of God. So as we progress through the Bible, what we're going to see is it's the actual Messiah that can and will save. And in our case, the actual Messiah that actually has saved us. But the figures that anticipate the Messiah, such as Noah, such as Moses, such as Joshua, cannot save. They cannot undo the original sin of Adam. They cannot undo the guilt of that sin, and they cannot do the curse of that original sin. So the clean animals become a sign, a token of what the Messiah must be like in order that his person and work be acceptable to God, especially concerning the salvation of God's people. And this is going to be important later when it becomes more and more clear that the person and the work of the Messiah of God is the center of the gospel that saves. And the core of that saving gospel is going to be, the core of that saving gospel will be the work of that Messiah of God. So, do you guys understand that? So in other words, the reason why the clean and unclean animals matter, all animals are corrupt. So what's the point of God making a distinction between clean and unclean animals? One of them is God wants to make sure that we understand it's the Messiah of God that saves, not the figures, not the shadows, not the anticipatory things. So for instance, later in the Old Testament, when God commands the burnt sacrifices or like substitutionary sacrificial offerings for Israel, Israel is not supposed to think that it's the animals that forgives them. That's not what they're supposed to think. And we get to that conclusion from Genesis. From Genesis, we work our way into the mind of God, and then we go, okay, here's what God is revealing. Here's what God is revealing. Okay, what is God revealing about these clean and unclean animals? It has to be the Messiah of God that saves. That's the only person that can save. And all these substitutionary figures and anticipatory signs, they can't save. So later we're going to learn the sacrifices of animals, the substitutionary sacrifice of animals, they can't forgive sins because the blood of animals cannot forgive sin. Cannot. But again, this is towards later. So that's one of the things, one of the important things why God made a distinction between clean and unclean animals, despite all creatures being corrupt by sin, by Adam's sin. Another important point, so another significance we need to note about why God differentiated clean and unclean animals, despite all of them being corrupted, is the purpose that God has for all creation. What are we talking about here? So God created all things to manifest and display his holiness. That's from Genesis 1, 2, and 3. You guys remember? From Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, so all things created are supposed to manifest God's holiness. And we have to remember the definition of what that means. If something is displaying or manifesting God's holiness, we call that God's glory, because it's displaying or there's an outwork of God's holiness in one form or another that we can see, or we can it's a communication of that holiness. So God's holiness manifested or displayed or outwork of it is called God's glory. So here we can say God created all things for his own glory, right? Because all things were made to display God's holiness. Therefore, all things were made for his own glory. So we need to make a distinction here before sin and after sin. So before sin, all of creation, and we mean all, everything inclusive, had their purpose to display God's glory, to reflect God's holiness in what they were and in the things they did, in the way they functioned. So their essence, what they were, and the outwork, the things the creation thing does, were meant to glorify God, meaning to display God's glory, to display God's holiness. So we have to take note here, there's an objective view here, which was here since the beginning of creation. And I have to emphasize there's an objective view here, because the sinner's heart is stuck in subjectivity. It can't go outside its own mind. There has to be something from the outside, from the objective world, to grab the subjective mind and pull it out. And that's what we call salvation, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. What we have to recognize is there's a objective element here, because this display of God's glory was there from the beginning, which is that all creation had their particular purpose for God's glory. All creation. So whether we're talking about whatever they were, light, darkness, water, land, firmament, the laws of physics, the laws of light, the laws of nature that allows for all these things, not allows, but that governs these things, laws of math, laws of logic and reason. God gave all these created things their objective goal to generally reveal God's character. And this is the essence of what they are, to reveal God's character. And that's an objective view, meaning that was there from God's point of view, and their entire purpose, objectively, is to serve that purpose, which is to reveal God's character generally, to reveal God's holiness. So this is before sin. After sin, God has to repurpose parts of creation because now it's been corrupted by sin. So God has to repurpose creation for a different end or a different goal. It's still meant to glorify God, but now there's a different mode or a different way they display God's glory. So, for example, we saw how animals, they were purposed for serving Adam, to help Adam glorify God by keeping the temple, dressing the temple, cultivating the temple. But now, after sin, they're repurposed to remind man of the wrath of God due to man's sin. Why or how so? Animals were required to be sacrificed to God as burnt offerings as a temporary grace period, a temporary abeyance, a withholding in which God would not pour out his wrath on the sinner who deserved nothing but the wrath of God. And instead, that act or that burnt offering act as a delay for the breaking out of God's holiness, for the breaking out of God's holy and consuming presence on that sinner. It acts to delay that wrath. Now, if you guys remember from our Genesis series, that's the definition of grace. The definition of grace is that which holds God's wrath back. The technical definition of grace, I should say. Because there's grace is used in many ways in the Bible, but you can say the way the Reformed technically uses that word grace is by saying it holds back the wrath of God. So this is important when we start talking about Paul, because when Paul uses the word grace, that's how he often uses it. Something, that's not how he always uses it, but oftentimes when he's talking about the wrath of God, he talks about the grace of God. He's not talking about the grace of God in some sort of abstract sense. He's talking about it in a way where he says, this is withholding the wrath of God on all sinners. We'll talk about that later, though. So the fact that God declares that he would only accept such and such a creature as a burnt offering and not others should serve as a warning that it is God who decides what is or is not acceptable to him. And that should sound familiar to you. If you remember what we were talking about in Genesis 1 and 2. We sinners do not get to decide what is right, what is good. God gets to decide what is acceptable and not acceptable, what is good, what is evil, what is right, and what is not right, because God is the creator. So now we can see from Noah. And the reason why this clean and unclean thing is important is because God keeps emphasizing this twice. In Genesis chapter 7, he says, bring the clean animals. Bring the clean animals. So it's not meant to go unnoticed. And the reason why God wants us to notice that is Noah's situation is a recapitulation. It's another, you could say, epoch or another high point where God is communicating his covenant with this one person to represent a holy nation in order to worship God in a holy area, a holy sacred space. So by differentiating these clean and unclean animals, God is saying, you don't get to decide what's right and what's wrong. I get to decide that. And if you go back to Genesis 1 through 3, we saw that it was God who declared such and such thing to be good for food and such things not to be good for food. For such and such things to be good in their creation and for such and such things not to be good in their creation. So if you guys remember when God created light and then he separated light from darkness, he said, this is good. But then he created Adam alone and he said, this is not good. And God said to Adam and Eve, you can eat from all trees. These are good food, except for this one. This is not good. So God is recapitulating that here, saying, here's clean animals, here's non-clean animals. These are acceptable, these are not acceptable. These are good, these are not good for burnt offerings. So in making a distinction for clean and unclean animals, this early in Genesis, what was and was not acceptable for the temporary restraint or temporary grace, right, to delay God's wrath, God is exposing every sinner to the disobedience of Adam, because that was Adam's original sin. So God is redisplaying that here. Are you going to decide, or is God going to decide? Or to put it more in a precise way, Will God rule over you as the creator and father, which means that the sinner has to acknowledge that it is God who decides what is or is not good? Or will you serve the false god, the idol you call yourself, and rebel against that order, the logos of goodness and evil, made by God? So does that all make sense? Because we're tying up more loose ends here, because we want to address these questions. By addressing it here, when we get to like the later parts of the Bible, why Abram was sacrificing, why all these things happen, we understand God is putting this to the front again. There was Adam's original sin. This is why we're under this curse, and this is how salvation has to happen through the Messiah, is what God is constantly pointing out here. So moreover, in addition to, hey, are you going to make your, so in other words, God has this objective purpose for all of creation. Will you receive that? Right? Will you receive that general revelation of God, or are you going to supplant that or replace that with something else? In other words, you're making an idol here. You're substituting something objective for something subjective. Something objective from God with something subjective from man. So moreover, will you acknowledge that man cannot but depend on God, and therefore must think God's thoughts after God in order to make sense of the world that God has created? Is that what you're going to do? Or will you refuse to give God his due recognition and his due worship, and live purposely in contradiction, refusing the knowledge of God, and instead give that credit due to God to creation instead, living as if creation somehow sustains itself, believing that your body and soul belongs to you and not to the creator of that body and soul? So is that sort of digestible? So we're talking about we're talking about why, if everything's corrupted, why is God even making a distinction between clean and unclean? Why doesn't he just get rid of all the unclean and then, have only clean animals? Well, because the unclean animals aren't essentially unclean. God is declaring something here. He's speaking through, by making something clean and making unclean, God is speaking through that and saying, this is good, this is not good, and I'm the one who decides that. It's a recapitulation of Genesis 1 and 2. So speaking of God's purpose for creation, if we don't have any questions, do we have any questions? No? Okay. Well, speaking of God's purpose for creation, another significance we need to recognize between clean and unclean creature is that God actually has a purpose for all of his creation, even when they are repurposed, even when they're affected by sin. God still has a purpose for them. Why? Because God is the creator of all of creation. And this hints at God's purpose for the unrepentant sinner as well as the wicked. The fact that there's these animals that represent the unclean of something that's not acceptable to God, it hints at God's purpose for the unrepentant sinners as well as the wicked. So in this new creation with Noah, which God is about to bring about through a flood, God could well have required clean animals only to represent the redeemed Messiah of God. Redeemed in God's Messiah. So God could only have left the clean animals if he wanted to, but he didn't. By purposely bringing the unclean animals into the ark as well, God is using them, the unclean animals, as a sign that even the unrepentant and the wicked serve their purpose in God's sovereignty. So let's take a look at Job 21, Proverbs 16, and 2 Peter 2. That the evil man is spared in the day of calamity, that he is rescued in the day of wrath. Okay? The evil man is spared by God in the day of calamity, and that he is rescued in the day of wrath. So this is like an Old Testament reference to like God's sovereignty. And in Proverbs, the Lord has made everything. So here, there's like no exception here. For its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. He's talking about that day of wrath when it says day of trouble. So then our brother Peter, the apostle of Jesus Christ, he recognizes this theology from the Old Testament, and he summarizes it this way. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from the trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. So the Bible is saying even for the wicked, God has a purpose for them. And for those of you that know the Jeremiah reference to, God is the potter, Israel is the clay. Paul, our brother Paul, he makes a further development for this theology, for this theme. And this is in Romans chapter 9. It's one of my favorite passages. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use? You could say salvation here. And another for dishonorable use, the wrath of God. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, so we're talking about God's holiness now, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. So God has prepared some people for destruction in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy. So God has prepared some people for mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. In other words, to receive his own glory. This goes into a bit of Calvinism. And here's what Paul is not saying. And this is why it's important that we had to go through Calvinism first to learn what Calvinism is, because people read this and they go, oh, how unfair of God to prepare somebody for wrath, to intentionally create somebody destined for eternal damnation. What Paul is not saying here is God coerced the sinner to sin to end up like that. That's not what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is God is sovereign. However, sinners have their own responsibility for the choices they make. And both of these are true. So for sinners in rebellion against God, this passage scares them because they go, oh, God is so unfair. How can God create people for destruction? How is it the sinner's fault then, is how the rebellers against God think. And without this, without understanding, you could say without understanding the mind of God from Genesis all the way up to the letters of Paul, that's the only thing we would see, because we would think, in our creation logic and our created reasoning, we would think, oh, everything's determined then, because in God's sovereignty, we can't have any choices. There's no free choices there. But that's not what the Bible is saying. In fact, that's why we had to discuss Augustinianism, Calvinism. It's the same thing a few weeks ago, because we're trying to understand here, this is true. God, in his sovereignty, in God's sovereignty, has full right over whether he prepares somebody for damnation or salvation. That's totally up to God. That's God's sovereignty. He decided this before creation. However, what the Bible is saying is not that God coerces sinners so that they receive the punishment of God. That's not what Paul is getting at. In fact, here's what Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. So if you're the sheep of God, right? If you're the sheep of Jesus Christ, well, let me put it this way. If you're not the sheep of Jesus Christ, you would see the verses in Romans chapter 9 and you would go, that's so unfair of God to make vessels for his wrath. However, if you are the sheep of Jesus Christ and you hear Jesus Christ calling you, what do you see in these verses? Could we go back to Romans 9? What do we see in these verses if you see that Jesus is calling you? What's so comforting about this verse if Jesus Christ is calling you, if you are a sheep? In order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy. Every sinner has the choice to go. So if you're an unrepentant sinner, and if you're in full rebellion against God, it scares you because you're like, oh, why is he so unfair? But if you understand the character of God and who God is, and how gracious God is, if you understand that, in other words, if you are the sheep of God, you look at that verse and you go, God have mercy on me, a sinner. And you would put all your hope in that Lord, in that God, who's so very gracious and merciful. So you can see how, like, some people, they get scared by this, but then if you're the sheep of God, you're like, that's great, right? Because you can call out to God for mercy and say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And what did God say about those people? We're vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand, right? So we can call out to God at any time. That's the choice that we make. And that's how we know we're called by Jesus Christ, is when we see this and we go, oh, the merciful God. So you hear the call of Jesus Christ, you hear the call of your master and shepherd calling you to be saved, and you go, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. So the fact that God commanded Noah to bring both clean and unclean animals into the ark lets us know God has his purpose both for the saved and the unsaved. He has his purpose, and it's all for his own glory. And this hints at while sinners and their sin are responsible for the evils of this world, sin is the problem here. And this is what it's hinting at. Even though sin is the problem, because of the evil that sin brings about, God turns that evil to bring about good. So God doesn't coerce people to sin, but when people sin, God can use that to bring about good, because God is Lord and creator over all things. What are we talking about here? Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. He's talking about the vessels of mercy here. For those people that call Jesus Christ their shepherd, right? Who call Jesus Christ their master. For them, all things, including evil things, work for good. Because God is the creator and he works, he's able to turn evil into good. So any question about this? Okay. So now some funny story about Noah's flood by Bill Cosby. So you guys need, whenever you guys get the time, you guys need to go online and look up Bill Cosby and Noah's flood, because I think it's one of the most greatest works of comedy ever. And it goes something like this. This is like a variation of it. So Bill Cosby does it way better, but this is a variation of it. And it's genius because it allows us to see what's actually going on kind of in Noah's mind. So Genesis 2:5 says, every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But instead there was a mist that came up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So there was no... Joe, is Genesis chapter 2, verse 5 there? If not, it's okay. Because I only have it as a note here, so I don't know if I can put it on. It doesn't matter. Yeah, so anyway, in Genesis chapter 2:5, the Bible is saying there was no rain. It was just mist that came out of the ground. And this is another loose end we're going to tie up, but only after the rainbow, because it'll make sense once the rainbow appears. So there's a particular word that's used for ark, and it's only used to describe Noah's ark and the ark that Moses was in. When he was a baby. It's tabah. So it's not used to describe a boat. So when the people are reading this in Hebrew, they're not thinking a boat when they think of an ark. They're thinking of something that saves whatever is in the ark. So here's how that joke kind of goes, and we want to sort of like gather. Like I said, this is very insightful for how the mind of Noah is working here. So God says to Noah, Noah, you need to build an ark. And it needs to be this cubits long and this cubits wide and this cubits. And Noah says, forgive me, Lord, but what is an ark? Because everyone knows there's no such thing as this thing that you need, that everybody has to go into to be saved from something. So God says, well, an ark is it's this big floating thing that needs to withstand the wrath that I'm about to send by a worldwide, even a cosmic flood, which will destroy everything. So then Noah says, remember, this is not in the Bible, this is just Bill Cosby's take on it, and it's very insightful. Noah says, what's a flood? Because everybody knows water has its boundaries. That's from Genesis 1. And there's not enough water to cross that boundary between water and the land. So God says, well, it's a situation where the whole world will be submerged underwater because it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights. And the water falling from the sky, in addition to the water coming out from the ground, is going to submerge everything. It's going to destroy everything, both land, sea, all that stuff. It's going to drown all things. And Noah says, rain? What's rain? Everybody knows water comes out from the ground. What's this water you speak of that's coming out from the sky? And God says to Noah, Noah, you can't understand it because you haven't seen it yet. But there will be water from the sky called rain. And there will be a flood. And you will need to build this thing called an ark to save all creatures in the visible realm. And the point that we need to take away from this comedy sketch is that Noah had to believe in something he never saw before. In other words, Noah and God has a history of a covenant, right? They have a history of relation. And through that relation, Noah understands God as the true and living God. And by that fact alone, when God says, Noah, you've never seen a rain before, but I'm going to send rain, Noah has to say, God, I know who you are. So if you say there's this thing that's going to be water from the sky that you call rain, then I believe it. Because I know that you're trustworthy. This is a reference back to Adam when God says, Adam, if you eat from this tree, you're going to die. Adam has never seen death before. Why? Because death came from sin. So without sin, there's no death yet. And now we Christians then are called to believe God's word when God says there will be a judgment of fire that's going to melt all the elements of the visible world. All the elements of the visible world. This is from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10 through 12. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Oh, and I want to make a note here. Thief in the Old Testament is not the same kind of, not the Old Testament, in the Bible, is not the same kind of thief we think of where people are sneaking around. Thief is a violent person who murders to steal stuff in the Bible. So when it says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief, it's talking about it's going to come with violence. It's going to be a sudden bang. It's going to be explosions and stuff. And then the heavens will pass away with a roar, the loud sound, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. And the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed, since all these things are thus to be dissolved. What sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? Okay, so it's a reference back to Noah here. Waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. It says heavenly bodies here, but in the older translations, looking for and hastening unto the coming day of the Lord, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved. So the heavens, the sky, they're going to be dissolved. We go, how can the sky be dissolved? How can you dissolve a sky? And the elements melt with fervent heat. When it's talking about elements, it's talking about all elements in the visible realm. So what's an element? Well, maybe water. Well, how does water melt? Right? So to us, it doesn't make sense. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense to us because we're like, how is the sky going to dissolve? Because Peter's being very graphic here. He's saying it's going to dissolve and melt, and like all the elements are going to be fervent, with this fervent fire of God. We're like, how is that going to happen? But it's coming. And if you read the context of 2 Peter 3, it's talking about Noah's flood. So even during Noah's time, they didn't know what rain was going to be and how damaging the flood was going to be. They didn't understand it. But Noah understood God, and that was enough because of that faith in God. That was enough to move Noah with fear to build the ark. And it's the same with us. God is calling everybody, especially Christians. Do you know there's going to be a flood of fire that's going to come, and it's going to dissolve all the elements of the world? We haven't seen it, so we can't make sense of it, but it's coming. And that's what God is saying, prepare against. Prepare against that day. Because remember, all the grace of God at this point are all temporary. It's a temporary delayance. You have to be inside the ark to avoid that wrath of God, to avoid that flood. Any questions? Okay. But does this make sense? Is this sort of like helping us to understand? And it's going to be the same, it's going to be the same you might say situation as Noah, where people didn't go into the ark because when it started raining. I mean, we're gonna talk about this later too. Noah's for roughly 90 years, maybe 100, for roughly that time, Noah is like preaching. We're gonna talk about this next week, but Noah's like, you have to come into the ark because he's a prophet of righteousness. Come into the ark because there's this wrath of God coming in the form of water from the sky, and people are like, Noah, everybody knows water comes from the ground. Everybody knows waters have their boundary. They can't cross over that boundary. Everybody knows this. But what happens? They didn't listen, and then they get swept up in the flood. Okay, well, if there's no questions, we'll pray, take offering, benediction. Father, we give thanks once again for all